In the winter of 1931, the northern Yukon was the kind of place where nothing unexpected happened. Temperatures stayed well below freezing. The land was empty for hundreds of miles. If something appeared out there, it usually had a reason. That's why the cabin raised concern. It sat near the Rat River, deep in the wilderness, far from any settlement. No nearby trap lines. No registered claim. Just a small wooden structure, recently built, solid enough to survive the winter. Someone had hauled lumber across frozen ground and put it together by hand. That alone meant effort. Planning. Intent. Local trappers noticed it first. They passed by during their routes and saw signs of recent activity. Smoke marks. Stored supplies. Someone was living there, quietly, without telling anyone. In the north, that mattered. Isolation wasn't illegal, but unexplained isolation was dangerous. People disappeared easily. Illness, injury, or starvation could kill a man long before help arrived. So word reached the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The assumption was simple. A lone trapper. Possibly unregistered. Maybe stubborn. They expected a conversation, a warning, and paperwork. Nothing more. An officer was sent out alone. When he reached the cabin, everything looked orderly. No chaos. No distress. Whoever lived there was careful. The officer knocked and announced himself. The door opened just enough for a man to appear. He was tall. Quiet. His clothes were worn but practical. He spoke with a slight accent, though it was hard to place. When asked for identification or permits, he didn't argue. He didn't explain. He refused. No anger. No fear. Just refusal. The officer warned him he would have to leave the area. The man said nothing. The door closed. Inside that silence was a decision. The officer walked away uneasy, but still calm. At that moment, no one believed this cabin would become the center of the largest manhunt the Arctic had ever seen. But it had already begun. The second visit was not meant to escalate anything. It was supposed to close the issue quietly. 2 officers returned to the cabin, carrying official papers this time. The message was clear and routine. The man was living on land without permission. He needed to leave. If he cooperated, there would be no trouble. The cabin looked exactly the same. No new tracks. No movement. No sound. They knocked. Waited. Then knocked again. When the door opened, the man did not step outside. He did not speak. He did not negotiate. He raised a rifle. The first shot came without warning. It slammed into a tree near one of the officers, close enough to spray bark into the air. The message was unmistakable. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a line drawn. The officers retreated immediately. They did not fire back. Out there, in that cold, with that distance from help, survival came before authority. They backed away slowly, then turned and left as fast as the terrain allowed. Behind them, the cabin remained silent. This single decision changed everything. What had been a paperwork issue became an armed standoff in the wilderness. The man inside the cabin had made his choice, and it was final. The RCMP did not rush back in. They knew better. Instead, they assembled a small team of trackers, men experienced with snow, rifles, and long days in brutal conditions. The plan was simple. Surround the cabin. Wait him out. Arrest him without bloodshed. When they returned days later, the cabin was empty. The stove was cold. Supplies were gone. Snow around the structure showed signs of careful departure. The man had not fled in panic. He had prepared. He had timed it. That was when the tone shifted. This was no longer about removing a trespasser. This was about finding a man who had chosen to vanish into one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth, in winter, and had done so calmly, deliberately, and ahead of trained officers. And the tracks he left behind were not leading away in fear. They were leading into the Arctic. At first, the trackers were confident. Snow preserves everything. Footprints. Drag marks. Broken branches. In winter, the land records every mistake a man makes. They found his trail easily. One set of footprints, moving steadily north. No signs of panic. No wasted motion. He walked like someone who knew exactly how far he could go in a day and when to stop. That alone worried them. Then the weather changed. A storm rolled in without warning. Wind erased tracks. Fresh snow buried old ones. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. For 2 days, the search stopped completely. When it resumed, something strange became clear. The man was still ahead of them. Not by hours. By days. He had crossed rivers where the ice was thinnest, choosing routes that slowed pursuit but kept him safe. He traveled at night, resting during daylight. When the trackers expected him to push forward, they found camps where he had waited, letting them pass before circling back behind them. He wasn't just escaping. He was controlling the chase. Then came the first ambush. A patrol moved through a narrow stretch of forest when rifle fire erupted from cover. One officer was killed instantly. Another was wounded before they could even see where the shots came from. By the time they returned fire, there was nothing to shoot at. The realization spread quickly through the search party. This was not a desperate fugitive. This was a man who understood terrain, timing, and patience better than they did. Someone who could survive alone, unseen, and armed in deep winter. Reinforcements were called in. Experienced trappers. Indigenous trackers. Even an aircraft, a rare and risky move in Arctic conditions. Yet no matter how many men joined the hunt, the results stayed the same. They followed. He vanished. Each day the temperature dropped further. Frostbite became a constant threat. Supplies ran low. Morale cracked. And somewhere ahead of them, moving through white silence, one man remained invisible, leaving just enough evidence to remind them he was still there. By the 3rd week, the manhunt had grown beyond anything the region had seen. More than 40 men were now involved. They carried modern rifles, heavy winter gear, and enough supplies to stay out for weeks. It didn't matter. The man they were chasing needed almost nothing. He traveled light, moving across terrain most men avoided. When he killed animals, he took only what he could carry and vanished before smoke or scent could give him away. He slept in shallow snow shelters instead of tents, leaving almost no trace by morning. Every advantage belonged to him. When the searchers set traps, he avoided them. When they split into teams, he slipped between them. Once, he doubled back and crossed his own tracks, waiting motionless as a patrol walked within meters of him, never noticing. Another firefight broke out days later. Again, he struck first. Again, he disappeared without injury. At this point, fear crept into the operation. Not panic, but respect. The trackers began to speak about him carefully. They stopped using his name and referred to him only as the man. No one claimed to understand him. No one predicted his next move with confidence. Then something changed. An aircraft spotted movement near the Eagle River. From above, the man looked exposed, finally vulnerable. Ground teams closed in, believing the chase was nearing its end. But the sighting had cost him something. He was slowing down. Blood was found in the snow. Not much, but enough to mean he was wounded. For the first time, the trail showed strain. Shorter distances. Longer rests. Still, he fought. When the final confrontation came, he fired until he could no longer stand. When they reached him, the silence returned. The Arctic had kept him alive longer than anyone thought possible. But it would not save him forever. When the shooting stopped, the man lay face down in the snow. He had been hit multiple times. His rifle was empty. Even then, it was clear he had not surrendered. He had fought until his body could no longer move. The searchers approached cautiously. For weeks, he had punished every mistake. No one assumed it was over until they were standing close enough to be certain. He was dead. Up close, he looked older than expected. His clothes were patched and worn, but clean. His equipment was simple, almost minimal. No letters. No identification. Nothing to explain where he came from or why he chose to live alone in the Arctic. They searched his body, his camp, everything he had carried. There was no name. The autopsy later revealed something that unsettled even seasoned trackers. Despite weeks of pursuit, gunfights, freezing temperatures, and constant movement, the man was in surprisingly good condition. He had endured pain, hunger, and cold without breaking. His wound showed he had been injured earlier in the chase and kept going anyway. When asked who he was, the authorities had no answer. They buried him in the north, under a marker that carried a name he had never given himself, the Mad Trapper of Rat River. Years later, fingerprints were matched. His real name was Albert Johnson. But even that explained nothing. No records of family. No reason for his isolation. No motive for his refusal. What remained was the silence. A man who spoke almost nothing. A man who survived alone where others failed. A man who forced an entire region to chase him across frozen land and left without telling anyone who he truly was.